What if I told you that the most famous Friday in human history
Right.
might have actually happened on a Wednesday?
Which is just a wild thing to even consider, I know.
It really is. I mean, or what if reconstructing the timeline of, the most scrutinized 72 hours in ancient history reveals this logistical puzzle so complex that it makes our modern bureaucratic nightmares look like a walk in the park?
Yeah, a complete walk in the park.
Welcome to the deep dive. Because our mission today is to really cut through centuries of accumulated tradition. We're going to examine the actual ground level logistics of the arrests, the trials, and the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth.
Exactly. And to do that, we're looking at a massive stack of historical sources.
Right. We've got ancient legal codes, topographical maps of first century Jerusalem, competing ancient calendars.
Because there's this massive calendar clash that scholars have literally been debating for decades.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because the standard narrative we've all absorbed.
The one that shapes the whole traditional liturgical calendar, yeah.
Right, it's incredibly compressed. We're talking an arrest late Thursday night, then this series of rapid-fire trials through the early hours of the morning, and a crucifixion by Friday afternoon.
But, when you actually subject that specific Thursday to Friday window to a rigorous historical stress test,
Yeah.
it just, well, it kind of falls apart.
The sheer volume of bureaucratic and physical movement is just staggering.
The math, quite simply, does not seem to add up.
It doesn't. I mean, I actually mapped out the traditional Thursday timeline on a topographical map of first century Jerusalem, and the physical requirements are just baffling.
Yeah, it's intense.
It's the equivalent of trying to get through, like, 6 different government DMV lines.
Well, that's a perfect way to put it.
Right. 6 DMV lines spread across a densely crowded city in the middle of the night in under 9 hours.
While navigating steep ravines.
Yes. And waking up heavily guarded government officials. I mean, if someone claimed they pulled off that itinerary today with modern transportation, you'd assume they were fabricating the story.
You'd call him a liar, yeah. But that is the literal sequence of events the traditional timeline demands.
So to understand why historians and biblical scholars question the mechanics of this timeline, we have to try and walk it ourselves, right?
We do. We're going to examine the physical terrain of Jerusalem, the stringent regulations of Jewish capital law, and the very real possibility that different groups were operating on completely different calendar systems.
Specifically the Essene solar calendar, which we'll get into because that is fascinating.
It changes everything, and we'll also look at the profound theological messaging that drove the gospel writers to structure their narratives the way they did.
Because by the end of this deep dive, you are going to understand how shifting a timeline doesn't just rearrange a schedule.
No, it completely changes the genre of the historical narrative.
A genre shift. I love that. That's the perfect way to frame it. So let's start by walking what scholars often call the marathon night.
The Thursday night hustle.
The hustle, exactly. So if we adhere strictly to the traditional timeline, we are looking at 6 distinct legal proceedings.
Crammed into a window of roughly 9 hours.
Starting around 11 p.m. Thursday and wrapping up by 8 a.m. Friday.
Right, so let's break that down. Stop number 1 begins late Thursday night.
Okay.
Following the arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, the prisoner is taken to the compound of the high priest for a preliminary interrogation by Annas.
And Annas was the former high priest, right?
Exactly. He was this powerful political patriarch who still basically pulled the strings behind the scenes.
So we have an off-the-books, late-night questioning session.
Yeah.
Then, according to the timeline, stop number 2 happens around 12:30 a.m.
Still within that same palatial compound, but now it shifts to a formal night session before Caiaphas.
The current acting high priest.
Right, and members of the Sanhedrin. This is the phase where they are actively bringing in witnesses in the middle of the night and ultimately land on a charge of blasphemy.
Okay, so that's 12:30 a.m. Then stop number 3 is scheduled for 5 a.m.
A dawn session in the temple precincts.
Just to officially ratify the verdict they reached during the night session?
Exactly, as soon as the sun came up. Which brings us to stop number 4 at roughly 6:30 a.m.
Because the Jewish authorities can't carry out a capital sentence under Roman occupation, right?
Right, so they have to move the prisoner to the Roman governor.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is taken to the Fortress Antonia to face Pontius Pilate.
And the charge shifts here, doesn't it?
It does. They're no longer arguing religious blasphemy. They are pitching a charge of political sedition to get Rome's attention.
Which is a whole different ballgame.
Completely. And Pilate realizes the political volatility of the situation, so he looks for a jurisdictional loophole.
He finds out the prisoner is from Galilee.
Right, and he sends him across town to Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee, who just happens to be in Jerusalem for the Passover festival,
So that's stop number 5.
occurring around 7:30 a.m.
And Herod basically treats the whole thing like a theatrical performance, right?
Yeah, he gets bored when Jesus refuses to perform miracles and just sends him right back.
Which leads to stop number 6 at 8:30 a.m.
The return to Pilate. The final sentencing, the scourging, and the crowd demanding the release of Barabbas.
And all of this bureaucratic ping pong wraps up before 9 a.m.
Yep.
See, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the primary issue with this sequence isn't merely the ticking clock.
No, the fundamental problem lies in the physical geography of first-century Jerusalem.
It's not a flat city.
Not at all. The city is built on a series of steep ridges and deep valleys. It is a severe topographical challenge.
Our sources draw a really sharp contrast between the upper city and the lower city.
Right.
The upper city was essentially like the Beverly Hills of antiquity,
Elevated, wealthy, filled with sprawling Hellenistic-style mansions.
where all the high priestly families lived, and then the
Right.
temple complex and the lower city sat completely apart from that.
Moving between these locations requires navigating just punishing elevation changes. Let's
Yeah.
trace the actual walking legs of this sequence.
Let's do it.
So, leg 1 goes from the Garden of Gethsemane, located on the Mount of Olives, to the house of Caiaphas in the upper city.
That's approximately 1,200 meters, right? Or about 3/4 of a mile.
Yeah, but the distance is deceptive. It's not a straight walk.
Right.
It requires descending into the deep, steep-sided Kidron Valley, crossing the valley floor, and then making a grueling, punishing climb all the way up the step streets to Mount Zion.
And we really have to factor in the physical condition of the prisoner here. That's a massive variable.
Absolutely.
Because the narrative describes a person who hasn't slept, who just experienced profound psychological distress in the garden.
Sweating blood, essentially.
Exactly. Who is bound under duress and surrounded by armed guards. They are not taking a leisurely stroll.
No, they are being marched up a vertical stone incline in the dark.
It's brutal. And then leg 2 takes them from the house of Caiaphas to the Sanhedrin's meeting place at the temple.
That's about 600 meters. They have to traverse the wealthy upper city and cross a bridge over the Tyropoeon Valley to reach the Temple Mount.
Okay, then leg 3 moves from the temple to Pilate at the Fortress Antonia.
Another 400 meters, navigating the massive, crowded temple courts to reach the towering Roman military barracks on the northern edge.
And we're still only halfway through the night.
Right, because now Pilate passes the buck to Herod.
So leg 4 is an 800-meter march from the Fortress Antonia straight across the city to Herod's palace near the Western Wall, by the modern-day Jaffa Gate.
And leg 5 is the exact reverse route.
Because Herod sends him back.
Exactly. Another 800 meters back to the Roman barracks. They marched a bound prisoner a full mile round trip across an ancient city for what amounts to a brief morning chat.
A completely pointless morning chat.
Yeah. And the final leg, from the Fortress Antonia to the execution site at Golgotha, the route traditionally known as the Via Dolorosa, adds another 600 meters.
So if we calculate just the walking time, ignoring the actual trials, the interrogations, the scourging historians estimate you were looking at 60 to 90 minutes of pure physical transit time.
At a minimum.
Right, so if the timeline starts at midnight and sentencing is at 8 a.m., that leaves roughly 6.5 hours to conduct 6 separate legal proceedings.
You're averaging just over an hour per stop.
The phrase used in our sources to describe this is Formula One style efficiency.
Which is funny, but true.
But ancient bureaucracies did not function like pit crews.
They really didn't. And the physical walking time is arguably the least of the logistical hurdles.
Really?
Oh yeah, the bureaucratic friction at every single one of those 6 stops is immense. Every arrival requires a complex handoff.
Right, you don't just walk into Pilate's bedroom.
Exactly. The arresting guards arrive at a palatial gate in the middle of the night. They must wake the guards on duty.
Those guards have to summon the household officials.
The officials must review the nature of the disturbance, figure out what's going on, and decide if it warrants waking the principal authority.
Whether that's Caiaphas, Pilate, or Herod.
And a Roman governor is not sleeping in his judicial robes.
No, I imagine not.
He has to physically be roused from sleep, dressed by his servants in the appropriate garments of state, and brought out to the judgment seat.
And the sheer administrative drag of that process happening 6 times in a row, seamlessly before breakfast.
Why?
It just stretches credulity.
It really does. And we also have to factor in the environmental reality of Jerusalem during the week of Passover.
Because the city is packed.
The city's population experienced a massive exponential swell as pilgrims flooded in from all over the known world.
So by the time Jesus is being marched back and forth between Pilate and Herod, that's legs 4 and 5, the sun is rising.
The city is waking up.
The narrow, winding stone streets would be choking with thousands of pilgrims preparing for the festival.
Exactly. A brisk 10-minute walk under normal conditions becomes a 30-minute claustrophobic struggle through a dense, chaotic crowd.
So the physical and geographical hurdles alone are staggering. But diving into the ancient legal codes reveals that the Thursday timeline isn't just logistically improbable.
No, it is flagrantly illegal.
Let's talk about the Mishnah.
Right. The Mishnah, which codified the oral traditions and laws of the period, specifically Tractate Sanhedrin, outlines the procedures for capital trials.
And the events described in the Thursday timeline break almost every single rule, don't they?
Pretty much all of them. The procedural safeguards in the Mishnah for capital cases involving the death penalty, were notoriously strict.
Designed to prevent rash, emotional, or rushed judgments.
Exactly. And the first explicit rule is that capital trials were strictly forbidden at night.
Wow. Strictly forbidden.
Yes. Cases involving property could be tried during the day and concluded at night, but a case involving a person's life had to be conducted entirely during daylight hours.
Which immediately invalidates the 12:30 a.m. trial before Caiaphas.
Completely invalidates it. But the rules go further. There was a mandatory cooling-off period.
Meaning they couldn't just rush to a verdict.
Right. A guilty verdict in a capital case could not be reached on the same day the trial began.
So how did that work? What were they legally required to do?
The law required the judges to deliberate, and if they leaned toward a guilty verdict, they were legally mandated to adjourn, spend a full night fasting, and reconvene the following day before handing down the final sentence.
Wow. So attempting to fit the trial, the verdict, and the execution into a single frantic 9-hour window completely obliterates that core legal requirement.
It completely ignores it.
And beyond Jewish law, the logistical narrative on the Roman side presents its own impossibilities.
Yeah, especially regarding the crowd.
Right, because by 7 or 8 a.m. Friday, the accounts describe this massive crowd gathered before Pilate shouting for the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus.
And if you think about the mechanics of organizing a public pressure campaign, it requires advance warning.
You don't just magically manifest a mob at 7 a.m.
No. Coordinating a mobilized vocal mob requires word to spread, factions to be rallied, and people to physically travel to the Roman fortress.
If the arrest happened in secret in a secluded garden in the middle of the night while the entire city was asleep,
the rapid assembly of a coordinated, politically motivated crowd by sunrise is just an organizational anomaly.
it really is. So, putting myself in the shoes of someone defending this timeline, I have to ask, if the authorities were flagrantly ignoring every rule in the Mishnah,
Holding night trials, skipping the fasting period.
bypassing basic legal protocols, why bother with the charade of 6 different hearings?
It's a great question.
If you are already operating outside the law, why shuttle the prisoner around town to 6 different locations? Why not hold one illegal summary trial in a basement, pronounce the verdict, and be done with it?
And that tension leads historians to 2 divergent conclusions. The first is a concept scholars refer to as the legal kidnapping theory.
Okay, legal kidnapping, what does that mean?
Historians who support the Thursday timeline argue that the chaos, the rush, and the illegality were precisely the point.
So it was intentional.
Right. The authorities were not attempting to hold a pristine, methodical, legal proceeding. They were operating out of sheer political desperation.
They were fighting the clock.
Exactly. A massively popular figure is in their custody. The city is overflowing with potentially sympathetic pilgrims. And the Sabbath, when all work, including executions, must cease begins at sundown on Friday.
So they needed the execution finished and the body off the cross before the crowds realized what was happening and instigated a riot.
That's the theory. Under the legal kidnapping theory, the multiple stops were not about checking legal boxes. They were exercises in passing the buck.
Like hot potato.
Exactly like hot potato. Caiaphas needs Pilate to execute the sentence because Jewish authorities had been stripped of the right of the sword by Rome.
Right, the jus gladii.
Yes. And Pilate recognizes a political landmine and attempts to pawn the problem off on Herod Antipas.
But Herod refuses to take the bait and sends him back.
It is a chaotic game of political hot potato played by desperate administrators racing against a volatile holiday deadline.
Okay, so the railroading theory makes sense of the panic.
It does.
But the alternative conclusion scholars draw from these logistical impossibilities completely rewires the narrative.
It really does.
What if it was not a panicked railroading? What if there's an alternative timeline that turns this chaotic, breathless night into a methodical, multi-day legal procedure?
This introduces the Tuesday arrest theory.
Yes, let's talk about the Tuesday arrest, because this completely shifts everything.
The Tuesday arrest theory is heavily supported by some of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century.
We're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, right?
Primarily the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, yes. These scrolls provided unprecedented insight into an ancient Jewish sect known as the Essenes.
And they were kind of a breakaway group.
Yeah, one of their defining characteristics was their total rejection of the official temple authorities in Jerusalem.
And that rejection extended even to the calendar they used.
Exactly. It's a fundamental clash of timekeeping. The official temple authorities operated on a lunar calendar, basing their months and festivals on the cycles of the moon.
Right, which was standard for a lot of the ancient world.
But the Essenes strictly utilized a solar calendar. Because these two mathematical systems track time differently, their dates for major festivals, like Passover, rarely synchronized.
They were literally out of sync with each other.
Completely. So if Jesus and his disciples were following the Essenes solar calendar or some regional variation of it, their observance of Passover, and therefore the Last Supper, would have fallen on a Tuesday evening rather than Thursday.
Wow. Moving the Last Supper and the subsequent arrest in the garden to Tuesday night changes the entire mechanical structure of the week.
It really does. It provides the one element that traditional timeline completely lacks.
Which is breathing room.
Breathing room, yes. It inserts 3 full days into the narrative, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning.
So if the arrest occurs on Tuesday night, the authorities suddenly have an ample, realistic window to conduct these proceedings.
Without violating Jewish law or the laws of physics.
Right, so the prisoner can be held in a cell.
And archaeological tradition often points to a pit or dungeon beneath the house of Caiaphas for that.
And with 3 days, the authorities can actually gather witnesses during legal daylight hours on Wednesday.
They can hold formal daytime sessions of the Sanhedrin.
They can easily fulfill the legal requirement for a night of fasting and deliberation before issuing a verdict.
The Mishnah's rules are suddenly being followed to the letter.
Which makes so much more sense. And the Tuesday timeline also resolves the bizarre brevity of the Herod Antipas encounter, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Herod was the Tetrarch of Galilee, a major political figure with deep regional interests.
He wasn't just a mid-level bureaucrat.
No, and the text in the Gospel of Luke notes that Herod had been wanting to see Jesus for a long time.
Right. So in a rushed Thursday timeline, he gets a 15-minute shouting match before sunrise.
Which is super anticlimactic.
But in a Tuesday timeline, Herod actually has the time to properly interview and interrogate a high-profile prisoner from his own jurisdiction.
Just as the text implies he wanted to.
So shifting the timeline transforms the genre. The Thursday timeline is an episode of a high-stakes thriller like 24.
A breathless, chaotic race against a ticking clock where everyone is sprinting through the streets and breaking protocol.
But the Tuesday timeline plays out like a methodical courtroom drama, like Law and Order.
It is calculated, bureaucratic, and strictly follows procedural law.
And crucially, the Tuesday theory isn't just some modern academic contrivance constructed to solve a puzzle, is it?
Not at all. It possesses deep, verifiable historical roots. Support for a Tuesday arrest is actually found in early church traditions dating back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. A prominent example is the Didascalia Apostolorum, which is an early Christian treatise on church order.
And it explicitly outlines a timeline where the arrest occurs on Tuesday.
Yes, it explicitly lays that out.
This historical tradition intersects with another major puzzle piece from our sources, which I've found fascinating. The concept of Spy Wednesday.
Oh, Spy Wednesday is a massive piece of this.
Because if the arrest happened on Tuesday, it completely recontextualizes the historical significance of Wednesday in the early Christian calendar.
Right. Many early Christian traditions, particularly in the East, maintain strict fasting days on Wednesdays and Fridays.
And the Friday fast is universally understood as commemorating the crucifixion.
Right, but the Wednesday fast has often been misunderstood by later generations as the day of the arrest.
But our sources indicate Wednesday wasn't about the arrest at all,
No, it was Spy Wednesday.
which sounds like an espionage thriller.
It kind of is. It was dedicated specifically to commemorating Judas Iscariot acting as a spy and finalizing the agreement with the religious authorities to betray his teacher for 30 pieces of silver.
Wow. And do we have ancient documentation backing that up?
We do. We see this practice codified in the Didache, one of the earliest known Christian manuals, dating to around 100 AD.
Okay, so very early.
Very early.
Yeah.
The text explicitly instructs followers to fast on Wednesdays and Fridays to distinguish themselves from the Pharisees and other religious groups who traditionally fasted on Mondays and Thursdays,
So Wednesday was cemented as the day of the betrayal pact,
and Friday as the crucifixion.
leaving the entire window in between for a methodical arrest and trial process.
Exactly. It fits perfectly.
The Tuesday theory elegantly solves the geographical, the legal, and the logistical friction.
Ties up a lot of loose ends.
But, of course, resolving the logistics only brings us to a much larger, more profound collision in the source material.
Because there's always another layer.
Always.
Yeah.
We have to address the massive calendar clash between the different gospel accounts of Holy Week themselves.
Right. Moving from logistics into the realm of theology and literary construction, we encounter a stark divide between the synoptic gospels.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yes, and the Gospel of John. The accounts agree on the overarching narrative beats. The entry into Jerusalem, the supper, the betrayal, and the crucifixion.
But their internal chronologies are fundamentally misaligned.
Very misaligned. And they pivot around a Greek term called periskou, or the day of preparation.
Let's break that down for the listener, because in a first-century Jewish context, the day of preparation almost universally refers to Friday, right?
Right. It is the day designated for preparing food, cleaning, and finishing all labor before the Sabbath begins at sundown.
Because strict Sabbath laws prohibited kindling fires or cooking.
Exactly. Friday is the preparation. The chronological clash centers entirely on when the Passover meal, the formal feeder, occurs in relation to this Friday.
So let's look at the synoptic view first. The synoptic gospels present a unified, unambiguous timeline.
They do. Matthew, Mark, and Luke explicitly describe the Last Supper as a formal Passover Seder.
Okay, so in their chronology, the Passover lambs are sacrificed by the priests in the temple on Thursday afternoon.
Yes. Thursday evening, after sundown, which Jewish reckoning counts as the beginning of the new day, Friday the 15th of Nisan.
Right, because days begin at sundown.
Exactly. So that night, Jesus and his disciples eat the Passover lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs.
And then the arrest follows that night, with the crucifixion occurring later that same Friday.
That is the timeline that shaped the famous Last Supper paintings and, our standard cultural understanding. The meal is the Passover.
But the Gospel of John presents a completely incompatible timeline.
Completely incompatible. In John's account, the Last Supper happens before the festival of Passover begins.
He describes a supper, but he goes out of his way to demonstrate it is not the official Seder.
John's timeline is revealed through a highly specific detail during the Roman trial on Friday morning.
Yeah, this is the detail that really blew my mind.
It's in John chapter 18, verse 28. The narrative notes that when the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate's headquarters, the Praetorium, they refuse to cross the threshold and enter the Roman building.
And the text explains their hesitation is based on ritual purity, right?
Exactly. Entering the dwelling of a Gentile would render them ritually unclean.
And John explicitly writes that they needed to remain clean so they could eat the Passover.
Eat the Passover. That singular phrase shatters the synoptic timeline.
Because if the religious leaders are refusing to enter a Roman building on Friday morning because they still need to remain pure to eat the Passover,
then the Passover meal has not happened yet.
Boom. In John's chronology, the lambs have not been slaughtered. Jesus is standing trial on Friday morning, and the official Passover Seder won't be eaten until Friday night.
The friction here is intense, because these texts were produced by communities deeply devoted to preserving the memory of these events.
Right. How does a community mix up the timing of the most significant religious meal of the year?
They don't. It's the equivalent of a modern family fiercely debating whether Thanksgiving dinner happened on Thursday or Wednesday.
It's not a detail that easily slips the mind. You don't just forget when you ate the turkey.
Exactly. So this discrepancy has challenged scholars for centuries. The prevailing historical and literary consensus is that this is not an accident of memory.
It's intentional.
It is intentional, profound theological messaging.
The writers aren't attempting to pass a modern lie detector test on chronological exactness. They are constructing narratives to communicate specific theological identities.
Let's look at the synoptics first. Placing the meal exactly on the night of Passover is architecturally vital to their message.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke are framing Jesus as the ultimate host and the new lawgiver.
Yes. By taking the fiercely guarded traditional elements of the Passover Seder, the unleavened bread and the wine, and radically reinterpreting them, stating, "This is my body, this is my blood," the narrative institutes a new covenant.
It overlays a new Exodus narrative directly on top of the old one, so the theological point literally requires the meal to be the Passover.
It does. But John, conversely, has an entirely different theological objective.
Because John isn't focused on the bread and the wine.
In fact, he doesn't even include the institution of the Eucharist in his account of the supper.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. John's intense, singular focus is on the Passover lamb.
This is where John's chronological shift becomes just a masterclass in symbolism.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Because if the Last Supper in John is not the Passover meal and the Seder is not scheduled until Friday night, we have to look at what is actually happening in the temple on Friday afternoon.
Right. According to strict Jewish tradition, the thousands of Passover lambs required for the festival are slaughtered by the priests in the temple courtyards on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan.
Specifically between the hours of 3 p.m. and 5 p.m.
Exactly. And in John's Gospel, Jesus is on the cross, breathing his last, on Friday afternoon.
At basically 3 p.m.
Yes. John meticulously shifts the timeline so that the crucifixion aligns perfectly, down to the hour, with the slaughter of the Passover lambs in the temple.
The visceral symbolism of that cannot be overstated. In John's theology, Jesus doesn't eat the Passover lamb.
Jesus is the Passover lamb.
The ancient sacrifice taking place on the Temple Mount is being simultaneously rendered obsolete by the ultimate sacrifice occurring outside the city gates.
John is making a profound theological declaration through the mechanism of chronology.
And you can actually track how precisely John aligns his narrative with the regulations for the lamb.
Oh, absolutely. Exodus mandates that the lamb is selected on the 10th of Nisan.
And John maps this to Jesus triumphantly entering Jerusalem, essentially being selected by the crowds.
Then the lamb is slaughtered on the afternoon of the 14th.
Jesus dies on the cross at roughly 3 p.m.
And the Passover meal begins at sunset as the 15th begins.
And by that time, Jesus is already in the tomb.
So John is essentially saying the theological truth of who this person is supersedes stopwatch accuracy.
Recognizing this literary freedom to prioritize theology over strict chronology opens our eyes to other massive narrative variations between the accounts.
It really frees you up to see what they were doing.
Because when you lay the synoptics and John side by side, you find several major structural differences that scholars have to reconcile.
The sources highlight a series of what we might call glitches in the matrix.
Glitches in the matrix. Let's walk through those. Because the first major discrepancy is the cleansing of the temple.
The iconic scene where Jesus drives out the money changers and flips the tables.
Right. In synoptics, this event occurs at the very climax of the narrative.
It happens on Monday of Holy Week. It serves as the inciting incident, the final intolerable provocation that forces the religious establishment to move against him.
But John unmoors this event entirely. He places the temple cleansing at the very beginning of the ministry in chapter 2 of his gospel.
It serves as an opening theological thesis statement rather than the climax.
Wow. And the second major narrative variation involves the events of the Last Supper itself, which we touched on.
Right. As we noted, the synoptics focus entirely on the institution of the bread and the wine as a new covenant.
But John omits this entirely. Instead, John devotes multiple chapters to an elaborate scene where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples.
A radical subversion of ancient social hierarchy, emphasizing servant leadership.
The third glitch occurs in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it is just a fascinating study in characterization.
It really is. The synoptics portray a scene of profound, crushing human agony.
Jesus is sweating profusely, deeply distressed, pleading with God to let the cup of suffering pass from him.
It is a portrait of severe psychological trauma.
But John presents a radically different emotional landscape.
There is no agony in John's garden.
None at all. When the armed cohort arrives to arrest him, Jesus doesn't wait to be identified by Judas.
He steps forward with absolute authority and declares, "I am he."
Using the divine name Ego Eimi.
Yes, with such force that the soldiers physically fall to the ground.
John's Jesus is never a victim of circumstance. He is a divine figure orchestrating his own destiny with total control.
And then there's the overarching timeline of the ministry itself.
Right, how long was he actually preaching?
Well, if a reader only possessed the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they would logically conclude that the public ministry of Jesus lasted approximately 1 year.
Because only one Passover festival is explicitly mentioned in those accounts.
Exactly. The universally accepted 3-year timeline of the ministry is derived entirely from the Gospel of John, which explicitly mentions 3 separate Passover festivals spanning the narrative.
The sheer number of discrepancies can feel overwhelming.
It really can.
I mean, it's like attempting to reconstruct the timeline of a complex event where half the witnesses are using Eastern Standard Time, the other half are on Pacific Time, nobody accounted for daylight saving time, and one witness is just telling the story out of order to make a thematic point.
That's a great analogy.
So how does historical scholarship attempt to reconcile these differing clocks impartially?
Well, historians generally divide into 2 main analytical camps. The first camp, which we explored with the Passover lamb symbolism, argues for intentional theological retiming.
Basically, the authors felt complete freedom to rearrange chronological and geographical furniture to highlight a deeper symbolic truth.
Right. But the second camp offers a fascinating sociocultural alternative.
Okay, what's the alternative?
They suggest that both timelines might actually be historically accurate reflections of an incredibly fractured first-century Judean society.
That is interesting. How does that work?
This theory relies on the cultural complexities of the era. First-century Jerusalem was not a monolith.
Right, there were lots of different factions.
Exactly. Different Jewish sects and regional groups literally used different methods to calculate the passage of time and the start of festivals.
Okay, we already discussed the Essenes using a solar calendar, while the temple used a lunar one.
But the sources point out even more granular divisions. There's evidence suggesting that Galileans, and we must remember Jesus and his core disciples, were from the northern region of Galilee.
Right, they were outsiders in Jerusalem.
Right. Galileans calculated the start of a 24-hour day from sunrise to sunrise.
Okay, sunrise to sunrise.
Meanwhile, the Judeans, the establishment centered in Jerusalem, calculated the start of a day from sunset to sunset.
Oh, wow. The implications of that are staggering.
Think about it.
If you are a Galilean, your Thursday lasts entirely through the night until Friday morning.
Yes.
But if you are a Judean, your Friday begins the moment the sun goes down on Thursday evening.
Exactly. Combine the Galilean sunrise to sunrise clock, the Judean sunset to sunset clock, and the Essene solar calendar.
And you have a single city where 3 distinct cultural groups might be observing the exact same religious festival on 3 completely different schedules.
Depending on whose cultural clock the writer was following, both the Synoptic timeline and the Johannine timeline could technically reflect a lived historical reality.
A specific time glitch regarding the hour of the crucifixion perfectly encapsulates this chaos, doesn't it?
It really does. Mark chapter 15, verse 25 explicitly states that Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour.
And in traditional Jewish timekeeping, starting from sunrise around 6 a.m., the 3rd hour is 9 a.m.
Yet John chapter 19, verse 14 states that Jesus was still standing trial before Pilate at the 6th hour.
Which would be noon.
So Mark has him on the cross at 9 a.m. John has him still on trial 3 hours later.
Some scholars attempt to reconcile this by suggesting John was using Roman civil time, right?
Yeah, Roman time started the day at midnight, meaning the 6th hour was 6 a.m., aligning the morning trial with Mark's timeline.
But other historians offer a much more grounded explanation.
A very human explanation. Ancient people did not wear wristwatches.
Right. Time was a fluid concept estimated by the position of the sun.
Amidst the trauma, chaos, and sheer physical exhaustion of that day, expecting eyewitnesses to pinpoint exact hours on a spreadsheet is just anachronistic.
The discrepancy is not a flaw.
No, it's a hallmark of messy, authentic human memory, attempting to process a traumatic event.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, moving from the physical dirt of Jerusalem to the highest levels of ancient theology. Let's pull all of these threads together.
We began by examining the geographical and bureaucratic nightmare of the traditional timeline.
We charted a 2-mile, 6-stop sprint across the steep elevation of ancient Jerusalem in the dead of night.
We looked at the sheer impossibility of moving a bound prisoner, waking officials, and holding trials with the speed of a modern pit crew.
We scrutinized the strict legal codes of the Mishnah, noting how the traditional timeline flagrantly violated prohibitions against night trials and mandatory fasting periods.
Which led us to the legal kidnapping theory. The idea that this was not a trial, but a panicked, illegal railroading designed to beat the Sabbath clock and avoid a pilgrim riot.
And then we explore the profound relief offered by the Tuesday arrest theory.
Right. By utilizing the Essene solar calendar, the narrative gains 3 days of procedural breathing room.
Transforming a chaotic thriller into a methodical legal process, supported by ancient texts like the Didascalia and the Didache tradition of Spy Wednesday.
Finally, we unpack the deep theological calendar clash between the Gospels.
We saw how the Synoptics placed the Last Supper on Passover to institute a new covenant.
While John intentionally shifted the timeline, so the crucifixion aligned perfectly with the slaughter of the Passover lambs in the temple, prioritizing theological symbolism over strict chronology.
Engaging with these texts requires recognizing them not as flat, straightforward incident reports, but as deeply layered, multidimensional historical documents.
They are woven with logistical puzzles, intricate legal drama, competing regional calendars, and profound theological architecture.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We started by comparing the traditional timeline to modern DMV lines and stopwatches. We naturally expect history to unfold with the precise, tightly edited logic of a documentary film. But if ancient writers, people intimately connected to these world-changing events, were entirely comfortable shifting timelines, rearranging events, and blending cultural clocks to emphasize a deeper symbolic truth, how does that change the way you read ancient history?
It challenges our modern assumptions about what constitutes truth. For an ancient writer, the theological meaning of an event was often far more true and vital to preserve than the exact hour it occurred.
Perhaps our modern obsession with stopwatch accuracy, demanding that every minute is accounted for and every geographical footstep perfectly aligns, is the wrong lens entirely. When we get trapped trying to make ancient texts balance like a modern mathematical spreadsheet, we risk missing the very reason the story was preserved in the first place. The next time you find yourself reading an ancient historical account, ask yourself, are you just checking the clock or are you actually listening to the message?